So let's jump right into the what and the why. I usually find it's a good idea when doing training to uh, put some definitions out there. Sometimes they're more helpful than other times, and sometimes they introduce new concepts that are pretty critical. I think in this particular case, we all have some intuitive feel for what these are, but let's start off with what is a project? A project is a unit of work whose goal is to produce deliverables and outcome. So unit of work just means some collection of tasks and activities that one or more people perform that individually and collectively produce deliverables and outcomes and help us to achieve goals. So oftentimes when we talk about a project with the examples on the right, we talk about some verbs that describe what we're going to do, like we're going to build a new welcome center. And we might have a project around that and define all the work that we're going to do to get our new welcome center up and running. Sometimes we talk about outcomes, and we might even describe a project as really being all about the outcomes. So the example on the right of repairing our relationships with employees is a description of a project that is very, very outcome oriented. So lots of choice there, but a project can be of various size and shapes. Sometimes projects last short periods of time. Project could last less than a day, but more often we're talking about projects that are taking weeks, years, or months. Perhaps more weeks or months than years, but certainly some projects are multiple year projects. A program then is what we use to describe something that's larger scale. And a program is broken down into separate projects. And these projects have relationships to one another, as we try to depict on this slide. But we have to have some additional tools, because when we get to something that requires this much effort to go in, has to coordinate the activities of so many activities and so many people, we need some additional skills to pivot to. And a program is clearly something that's more complex and larger than a project. So the examples I put on the right were things like establishing a new clinic, right? In the first case, we talked about a project of establishing a new welcome center. That might be a project that's part of an overall program of setting up a whole new clinic, as an example. And sometimes, similarly, we would describe a program in terms of its goals. And the bottom example over here of making our economic model more sustainable is certainly a goal. And you can imagine that program could be very multifaceted ultimately. We often talk about swim lanes within large programs, and those are just collections of related projects. But I didn't want to overwhelm you with too many definitions and terminology here, so hopefully I've succeeded in that. Now, let's emphasize the word management here. So we defined a program and a project. What do we mean by management? And to do that, I'm going to refer to three phases of managing a project. And again, these might be somewhat obvious, but these are all pretty critical. Up front, there's a definition and planning phase. And what we're doing there is trying to figure out what it is we're trying to accomplish, why we're going to do anything at all, why is the status quo not an option, who will do what is part of the definition and planning, or who do we think will do what, and when do we actually achieve the outcomes? When do we want to see the results of our hard work and labor? And then lastly, how are we going to define success, and how will we know when we've achieved it? So definition and planning sometimes can take days, weeks, or also months. Typically doesn't take years, but it's a very, very important part. And I've seen it both underdone and overdone. Underdone in the sense that people just jump right in and they want to get into execution more quickly than they should, and they didn't really understand the tasks that they were taking on. And it can also be overdone. I can see people kind of spend way too much time in definition and planning, analysis paralysis, if you will. Um, Execution is the second phase, and of course there we're executing the plan, and we've established priorities, and we're going to continue to set priorities as we execute the plan. We're going to monitor our progress, and we're going to replan as needed, and we're going to manage issues and constraints are two very key elements of the execution phase. Now, the execution phase, again, is considerably longer typically than the definition and planning phase, and the execution phase requires some complementary skills to definition and planning. But this is when most of the hard work gets done. We get to challenge the assumptions we made in the definition and planning phase. The last phase is operations and learning. And so the last part of managing a project is when you decide to go from a project state to a more normal operations state. And an example of that would be the Welcome Center that we talked about. If we did a whole bunch of work and we launched and we did a pilot of the Welcome Center where we opened it up for a week and we greeted patients into the Welcome Center for a week, and then we kind of closed it down and made some changes and got it ready again. At some point in time, we're going to shift from being a project to a normal state of operations, and quite often that can be problematic, as we'll talk about later. We want to be able to sustain our outcomes and continually adapt. The benefits of projects often decay if we don't prevent them and we don't monitor them, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And then also we want to be able to learn. And this is one of the best things about an institution building program and project capabilities is the opportunity to pass those learnings forward to future generations. So this is what we mean by manage. And often when we think of a manager, we expect them to do all three of these things, but we all have strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes people are better at planning, other people are better at kind of doing it, and other people may be better in harvesting the learnings and making things reusable. The last thing that's important to talk about here is this notion of what I'll call phase containment. But when we shift between these three phases, or any phases within the course of a project or program plan, it's useful to ask the question, are we really ready to proceed? Is the prerequisite of the next step in the recipe being met, or has it been met sufficiently that we can move forward? And this is one of the key lessons learned in my experience in program and project management, that sometimes people rush to get to the next step, and they end up creating downstream problems that are more complicated and could have been avoided right up front. So hopefully that's a good introduction, and a good thing to discuss now would be, why are program and project management so important? And obviously I've hinted at many of these thus far, so I won't drain this too long. But the first is that we increase our chances of success by following sound management principles. And many projects, some would even say most projects, fail to achieve their outcomes or clearly their potential ultimately. And so even when you execute well and you have a solid plan and you've learned from prior initiatives, sometimes projects fail for reasons that we don't control. But what sound program and project management does is helps us reduce the risk of failing for things we do control. The second topic is management involves trade-offs, right? That's a key aspect of being a good manager. And that means that we all have priorities and our institutions have constraints, and sometimes we're asked to pick between options that have some benefits and some downside to them, and that's the essence of a trade-off. So management of key resources is an important aspect to this, because we often don't have enough time or money to do everything we want, and so we're having to prioritize things. The third reason why program and project management are important is that predictability is a key to getting more accomplished in the future. I've worked with institutions with thousands of people who do nothing but project work. And when you can't make accurate predictions of when one project is going to be done, it's really hard to think about how you're going to start the next project after that. And so, in these times of tremendous change in Africa and frankly all over the world, being predictable in our project delivery is a very important characteristic. It gives us an increased ability to use our resources wisely. The other reasons are pretty personal. Being a better program and project managers can help you in all aspects of your job, your vocation, and your lives. Not that we all need to develop detailed to-do lists every day for how we're going to spend our time. Now that's not a bad work habit, I must say, but these skills that you learn to more proactively make trade-offs and all the things you get from managing programs and projects can have a lot of sidebar benefits in your life. You can just become more productive and free up time to do the things that are more important to you. You can achieve even more complicated change and creation with these skills than without them. And our world is getting increasingly complex, and the tasks of what we need to get done are becoming more complicated. It's very key that we find a way to build the institution's ability, your institution's ability to take on ever increasing complexity change. And of course, the last reason, very personal, is that it can be quite fun and challenging. I love the trial and error of developing a plan and then getting into executing the plan and seeing how it's going, figure out what assumptions I made that were right and which ones I made that were wrong, and being able to kind of learn in the process. And we'll talk a lot more about that, but hopefully you'll find aspects of program and project management fun and challenging as well.